What's going on, guys? Aaron from Top Tier Gaming here, and today I'm coming at you with an updated deck tier list for the brand new ban list that got released last Monday and will go into effect October 3rd. And yeah, I'm just going to be ranking all of the decks going into next format because this ban list definitely showed us that one deck is probably dominant, but where do the other decks sort of stand? And yeah, I'm just gonna give my thoughts going into it. Of course, this is the beginning of a format, so these are sort of my preliminary thoughts and where the format will sort of be at the start of the format. And of course, as the format evolves, these things could change, and if they evolve drastically, I'll definitely make another tier list. I'll probably have another deck tier list after Darkwing Blast, where the meta will get a little bit of a shift. But going into the start of this next format, where do all the decks sort of stand? And that's what I'll be trying to rank in this video. Before we get into it, I do want to let you guys know, Discord link down below along with all of our other social media links. Also, I'm trying to hit 20,000 subscribers, so if you do enjoy this type of Yu-Gi-Oh content, you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps me out and what I do here on the channel. And without further ado, let's start ranking some decks. So one thing I want to mention is every time I do a deck tier list, I keep adding more decks as sort of the game evolves. I'm trying to rank all the sort of relevant decks. So when we get to one that is probably not super relevant, I'm not going to spend too much time on it as I've done in the past in an attempt to sort of make this a little shorter. So going into it, we have the tiers as follows. We have tier 1, tier 2, rogue, almost rogue, and we have fuel to keep you warm in the winter. Now, I don't know, I think I had this on my last deck tier list. I should have come up with something, a new sort of witty thing here for the decks that just aren't that great. But yeah, we do not. But without further ado, let's start ranking some decks. We have ABC, I'll put in almost rogue. It's definitely better than kindling, but yeah, it's definitely not seeing any play and it's not super great. I'm gonna also put burning abyss, PK in the same sort of section of the tier list. Now, I feel like this tier list, because we are in a format and the ban list definitely showed that, we're in a format that is almost a one deck format at this point, and it's looking like tier element could be extremely strong. So I feel like this list is going to skew more towards the bottom. That does not mean these decks are bad. I think ABC Brave is actually pretty strong when it's playing. I actually really think Phantom Knight is actually a good deck and is still strong this format. So when I put, like, if you have a deck here and I put your deck down here, it does not mean it's bad. Just how I feel it's in the meta is not at its strongest point. So let's get that caveat out the way. Burning Abyss, almost rogue, maybe even fuel to keep you warm in the winter. Konami, please give us 3 Beatrice. Pendulum, Electromite still is not here. They didn't really get anything back. It's still just about almost rogue. Plunder Patrol I really like because Brave didn't get hit. Now, that being said, I still feel like Plunder Patrol is maybe a rogue deck actually. Like, where am I going to put rogue if, like, it just feels like tier element is, you know what, let's just rank that. Let's stop playing. Tier element is so far ahead of the other decks that it feels like they're that far ahead that it's almost harder to rank decks like these when tier is such above and beyond what is expected of a deck. That being said, Plunder I think is like sort of skirting the line between rogue and almost rogue, because it actually does well at events that it goes to. So I'm going to put Plunder in rogue. I think this deck's good. Brave didn't get hit. If it's not good, I'm sorry for debating you, but that's where we are right now. Heroes I actually want to put in rogue. I think heroes are very good because of the man you see right here. If tier element is the best deck, heroes get a huge boost because Darklaw is the destroyer of worlds. I mean, you stick this card, your opponent probably loses, right? And DPE is obviously really good. It's got just a lot of great options. It only fears Nib, and there are some ways around that as well with, of course, Crossout Designator. So I think heroes are in a better spot than they've been in the past. So that's pretty cool. DDD are fine, but when you're playing a combo deck, you have to sort of compare yourself to tier element, and I feel like DDD doesn't have any strong tools against tier. Like, at least this, like, Plunder gets Moark more reliably, which is not bad versus tier. DDD I almost don't feel is like, I don't feel like Deus is really good versus tier elements. It's like okay versus Kit Kalos if they don't chain block. Is this rogue? I'm gonna put DDD in almost rogue. Despia I'm gonna put in rogue. Now if we're talking about tier element Despia, shoot, maybe Despia's in tier 2. I guess I'll put Despia in tier 2. It's really hard to rank because Despia as a pure deck almost doesn't exist anymore. I've seen a couple of lists running where Despia is still here. But I feel like if you're playing Despia tier elements, it should at least be in tier 2, right? Because tier elements are just crazy. So I'll put it in tier 2. Dinomorphia, interesting. I'm going to put Dinomorphia in Almost Rogue. I love this deck. I have a top 4 with it at a regional because, you know, I do like playing the deck, and I thought it was really strong in that format besides Branded. But I feel like it's really hard to play Rekstrom Turbo when tier elements have a field spell that says pop, and then you're just really sad. So I don't know. I feel like Dinomorphia also sort of skirts this line between Rogue and Almost Rogue. This is such a thin line, this format. It feels so weird. It feels like maybe I shouldn't even have Rogue and Almost Rogue because they're just too close. Regular Dinosaur, I'm also just going to put in maybe Rogue. I don't know. I feel like Dinosaur is okay because obviously Tyranno comes down on a tier board and says punch. It doesn't always work that way, and I think Dino has their own problems, but honestly, I could see Dino almost being Rogue. Therion, this is like Brave Therion. That deck with the Punk stuff, this is like Punk Therion, right? Punk is toast, so this deck is now fuel to keep you warm in the winter. Dragon Maids, I'm going to put them in Almost Rogue. Like, they're not terrible, but when the Bisted cards come out in Darkwing Blast, I think Dragon Maid get a little better. For now, they might just be fuel to keep you warm in the winter, to be honest. Dragoon Turbo, I'm going to put it in Rogue, or Almost Rogue. Gosh, this tiering is tough, but yeah, I mean, like, if you're a Dragoon Turbo deck, you're probably going to get eaten alive by Super Poly, but if you don't get Super Poly, Dragoon is not terrible right now, so I'll put Dragoon in Almost Rogue. Eldritch, I'm going to definitely put in Rogue. Like, tier Eldritch is something I've seen running around. I think Floodgates are pretty good, especially when you only have to prepare for maybe one deck, so you might even be to the point where you can main Shadow Imprisoning potentially, or at least side it, and that's super amazing versus tier, so I think Eldritch can definitely compete. Fluandereeze, I'm definitely going to put in tier 2. This deck is insane because it can run D-Shifter. Sort of the same thing with Exosister. I think both of these decks are just D-Shifter control at this point. And Exosister in particular has an amazing matchup into tier elements. Naturally, engine to engine, Exosister benefit a lot from tier elements doing their thing. So I also think Fluandereeze has a good tier matchup because Statue is like, what are you going to do? Like, are you going to normal summon against Statue so they can proc their map? Like, it's very hard for tier to play against either of these decks. So I feel like these decks find themselves in a phenomenal position. So yeah, I think Exosister and Flunder are great. Drytron, do not sleep on this deck, guys. This deck does nothing fair. Ben 10 just went to 3. I think Drytron is a super solid combo deck. It almost doesn't matter how good tier is sometimes, if Drytron, especially if they go first, because Drytron are going to skip your turn if they're on the Amorphage plus Thunder of Ruler build. If they're just on regular good stuff with like, what was the other variant? Like Vanity's Ruler. That's also a very hard card to play against. So I feel like going first, this deck just kind of shreds, and then it's never been terrible at going second either. It's like okay going second now. The problem is going second is going to have to deal with spell cancelers sometimes, and this doesn't play too many hand traps, so Drytron isn't like the top of tier 2, but I definitely think it's better than these rogue decks potentially. I think Drytron is actually really strong with 3 Ben 10. Altergeist, I mean, as a catalyst for Mystic Mine, maybe it's better than I'm giving it credit for, but it's just a Mystic Mine deck. I'm just gonna, you know, I mean, I'll put it in almost. I'll put it in Rogue. Is it better than these decks? No. I'll put it in almost Rogue. Libromancer. This is fuel. Hulk is banned. This deck, in its past iteration, does not exist anymore without Hulk. So maybe someone can retune this deck to be it playable, but the Libromancer deck we know is gone. It is toast. Harpies. They're obviously fuel to keep you warm in the winter right now. Harpies really need some form of support. I know they just got the new pet dragon, but they need a new like Harpy monster. Earth Machine, interesting. I'm gonna put Earth Machine in Rogue. It can play a lot of different floodgates that are good versus tier, namely Rivalry, where I think this deck has some potential against that deck, and you can play a lot of really good go second cards against tier, like Mystic Mine. I don't want to say that, but it's something you can do. And yeah, it has a lot of flex, or it has a decent amount of flex, which I think could make it okay. And it can play Skill Drain and Rivalry and good things like that. So I think it's a little better than some decks here, but it's again not that amazing, so I'll just put it in Rogue. Adagnister, I want to put it in Rogue just because like it's really hard for tier to out the Arrival. Like, if you get a 5k Arrival, it's pretty hard to out. Yeah, I feel like the Arrival is kind of like that for everyone right now, so I think this deck's not terrible. Alistair, honestly, after the Banlist, Alistair got a huge buff. I mean, Nadir's at 3, Fusion Destiny's at 3 if you want to play that route. That being said, it's like you're still choosing to play a Fusion deck that isn't tier Element, and that in and of itself, you're sort of just an almost rogue, because it's like, why play Alistair? Tri-Brigade's interesting. So Tri-Brigade Sprite did not really get hit unless you, like, Tri-Brigade Sprite, I've seen some play Swap Frog, I've seen not play Swap Frog most of the time. I think Swap Frog was more of a test variant for Tri-Brigade Sprite in some versions, but I feel like you definitely can play it without it. Tri-Brigade Sprite, I'm going to put in Rogue. I don't think it's as good as regular Sprite, but I think it's actually the best version of Tri-Brigade right now, and definitely not terrible. My favorite, Prank Kids. Every time I get to put Prank Kids in this tier, I feel a little bit better about myself. Like, I haven't gotten tired of putting Prank Kids at this tier. In fact, every time I do it, I feel like I win $1 million. So, Prank Kids are down here. They are the fuel to keep you warm in the winter. Labyrinth, I'm going to put it in Almost Rogue. I actually saw this do really well in the recent Chalice Line Monthly. So, I don't know what list they were on, but this deck is not terrible. It's not great, but after Darkwing Blast, it does get a little bit better, so that's something to look forward to. Going into the next format, it's nothing great. Definitely just an Almost Rogue deck. Madolche, I will put in also Almost Rogue. I feel like once the Duck comes out in Darkwing Blast, this deck gets a lot better. But until then, even though it has a decent matchup in a tier, it just can't do anything against a tier board. Like, going first, sure, this deck is fine against tier, but honestly, it's nothing super amazing. I have high hopes for this deck. I have for the last few tier lists. That being said, I just don't think it's there quite yet until the Duck comes out in Darkwing Blast. Math Mech, a definite tier 2. This deck's great. This deck has been solid throughout the entire Power of the Elements format. It's still arguably the best Cyburst deck. It is the best Cyburst deck, I think I can confidently say right now, in the way it sort of lines up with what's being played in the meta. Yeah, it's a very solid deck. Sky Striker, I'll put this in Rogue. I actually think this is probably still one of the best Mystic Mine decks we have. And its play has dropped off a lot, but I feel like going into this next format, especially at the start of formats, Sky Striker usually finds itself in a good spot. Like, people go to like a go-to, and I feel like you'll be seeing a lot more Sky Striker, especially at the beginning of a format. And I do think like Shark Cannon's pretty good, and that this deck's okay. This deck does have to watch out for Spell Canceller though, so do with that what you will. Rika is a super interesting one. I think this deck is still tier 2, and Rika is like really good against tier elements, or it has been in my testing, like especially like multiple different versions of tier elements, because they put up things that don't like to be destroyed by card effects, and then you tribute them for cost, right? Or no, the things love to be destroyed by card effects, or, you know, sent to graveyard by card effects, and then you actually end up sending them for cost. And it always has put Rika, in my opinion, in a pretty good position against this. And Rika has like a good matchup against most of these decks across the board. It's not great versus Flunder, but it's also not terrible. Honestly, yeah, I think Rika is still a really strong deck. Nothing got hit. It can still play Rivalry. It's still a super strong contender in the format, I think. But yeah, definitely not tier 1 by any means, so I'll put it in tier 2. Adamantipator, Almost Rogue. It's like a fair enough combo deck. It's not doing anything too crazy right now. Runic is definitely very good. Now, you have Runic variants. You have Runic Mystic Mine, which has shown up time and time again. You have Runic Sprite, which is probably the best variant of Sprite with Evil Twin still. Yeah, Runic is definitely, as an engine, it's definitely a solid engine, being played in a lot right now. I think Runic is very good going into next format. Gazelle Turbo, definitely Almost Rogue. I think this is the weakest Cyburst deck we have right now. It's just at a point in a tier like 0.5 format or a 1-deck format where this deck just doesn't do enough to keep up like it has in the more open formats, because it's just kind of good versus everything. Shark is not bad, but it's not great. I'll definitely put this in Almost Rogue. Same thing with Weather Painter. They can play Skill Drain, Mystic Mine, D-Shifter. The fact that this deck can play D-Shifter, maybe this deck's actually a little better right now. You know what? Just because, I'm actually going to put this at the top. Can I? Of Almost Rogue. I still think people are sleeping on this deck because it's slow rolling, but it's a deck that can main D-Shifter, so like inherently I think this deck's pretty good right now. Sprite is tier 2. I mean, this deck took a hit in my opinion. I feel like Sprite was already sort of leaning at tier 2 going into like the last couple of weeks. So them getting the Ronin Totem hit, I think, has solidified their spot as more of a tier 2 deck, and where tier elements are essentially the only tier 1 deck. And that's really tough for Sprite, but I do still think it's one of the better decks we have right now. So I think Sprite is probably the second strongest deck potentially still. Maybe it's Exo Sister, maybe it's any of these decks, but Sprite's still solid. I think Sprite's still good. Sword Soul, I think, is a solid rogue. I don't think it's a tier 2 deck. I do think we've seen this deck perform a little bit at the regional level, getting some top 8s. And that's really cool. So, you know, congrats to the Sword Soul players that did that. I don't think it's a tier 2 deck still. I definitely think it's a rogue contender, but it's still doing its thing. It's still strong enough to compete, but not at like the super high level in my opinion. Dragon Link, they got pretty destroyed. Some variants of Dragon is still going to exist, and it's probably going to be, you know, I'll put it here. It is probably going to be better than Fuel to keep you warm in the winter. That being said, losing Hauka Fibrax and Chaos Ruler, that is really tough for Dragon Link, so I'm going to put them in almost rogue. Trap Tricks, right now it is just Fuel. This deck is getting a structure deck very soon, though, in the OCG, and we'll be able to see what new cards they get, and I'm super excited to see what Trap Tricks get. Is it actually almost rogue? I'm sort of thinking that maybe it's almost rogue just because I put Labyrinth here, so yeah, I'll put Trap Tricks in almost rogue because, yeah. Evil Twin Sprite, I think, is like the best version of Sprite with the runic stuff. It's really weird. Like, you should put all these three together. This is like one deck, actually. So, yeah, I mean, they're all the same deck, so should they actually be here? I don't know, but yeah, all versions of Sprite with this is good stuff. Marincess, I will put in Rogue. That is Faker. Where is my Marincess? Okay. Blue Tank, I'm going to put it in Rogue. It's definitely, I wouldn't say it's as good as Ad Ignister right now because its end board doesn't compete with anything the decks are doing right now. It's like not good enough, whereas the Arrival actually kind of is. And I would say Marincess is not as good as Mathmech. So Marincess, even though it's one of my favorite decks of all time, it pains me to put it in Rogue, but that's definitely where it is. Kairushin, this is Fuel right now, although if this gets established, it's not bad versus any deck, right? The problem is this deck's really slow and it never gets established, so we'll just put it in Fuel. Agents, honestly, I've seen Agent Sprite deck pop up recently, and that's really nifty. I do think Agents are showing some like cool stuff with the Sprite engine, and it's a really cool deck. That being said, I'm not going to put it in Rogue confidently, so I'll put it in Almost Rogue. Virtual World, kind of in the same position here. There are so many Almost Rogue decks, and I said this tier list was going to skew more towards the bottom, and that's just because of how strong Tier Element is compared to everything else at a glance, right? Punk decks are now down here. You know what's funny? I'm actually going to put Punk in Almost Rogue, because I do think Jam Drive Control is still good enough. I think Jam Drive Control is obviously where this deck is going to go. It's where it has to go without Chaos Ruler and Hulk. Now, is Jam Drive Control enough? Honestly, I think it's not a bad deck. You're getting free draws every turn. You have trap cards. Jam Drive is a good card. Search hand traps. I'm going to put it in Almost Rogue. I think Jam Drive is still pretty good. Zombies, I think these always find themselves being okay. Yeah, I'll put this in Almost Rogue. I mean, this deck's really good, but I don't think it's as good as these decks. Gren Maju, Almost Rogue. Holy moly, look at this tier list. We just have so many decks that are just on like the precipice of being super playable in the format. Like, if this was a tier list for our Nationals format, these would all be amazing decks that you could see because we have like 15 viable decks. But right now, they just feel a little lackluster, so I'll put that there. Infernity, that is Fuel to keep you warm in the winter. So now some of like, well, one of the new decks that we'll say, because Judgment just came off the list. So Spellbooks, finally playable again. Where do they find themselves? I'm initially going to say Almost Rogue. Spellbook of Judgment is one of the craziest cards printed in this game's history, don't get me wrong. This card, even today, I don't think there is any singular card that gets you as much advantage as Spellbook of Judgment does. I just don't think there's a card in the, like, in theory, this card can net you more advantage than a card like Sixth Sense. Like, this card does more than Chaos Ruler, probably does more than Casino Mill 8, right? Like, this card in a vacuum is probably the strongest card ever printed in theory. Maybe it's Max C, but that being said, the deck itself is not that great, and it's still, like, this card being able to be hit by, like, Ash is really tough, something that didn't happen back in the day. And I don't think the engine can keep up with how good this card is. And now we have like really strong go second cards for a card like Jowgen, right? It's not like a super big threat. My opinion on this card is it's essentially on this deck is it's essentially Fluandereeze without D-Shifter. And Fluandereeze does it better with a stronger engine. So I do think it's almost rogue because I don't think it's as good as Fluandereeze. Now, I have added Morella to this list, usually denoted by Swap Frog, but Swap Frog initially represented Paleozoics, and that's why this was on this list. However, Swap Frog himself and Ronin Toad are gone, so that doesn't represent Paleozoics, so Morella's here to represent the new Paleozoics, and Paleo really doesn't play with the frogs anymore, except Totally Awesome. Paleo has evolved in several different ways. Paleo actually got one of the biggest buffs in Power of the Elements, and I've sort of neglected almost about talking about it, except when I briefly mentioned it here. But both Sprite and Tier are amazing for Paleo. Now, I don't want to make this a Paleo video, but I do think Paleo, like Paleo Tier, is a rogue deck. Potentially, maybe almost rogue. I think this deck is super slept on. If you ever see it play, it is amazingly fun. I don't know how else to describe it. The fact that the deck works the way it does and it gets like so much dopamine off of a mill where you're running just 40 good cards to mill. I think this deck is pretty good. I think Paleozoics are a lot better than people are like, the masses probably look at Paleozoic and they'll think that deck is doing nothing, but this deck is definitely picking up steam in the community, even if it's still on the low. So yeah, watch out for Paleozoic Tier. I do think this is still like a pretty good deck. I mean, it's got tier limits in it, so it's definitely going to be good by default. But yeah, Paleo. I'm going to put it in Rogue because Paleo Tier is pretty good and the Sprite cards are good. So yeah, that is going to wrap it up for this deck tier list going into the brand new format. Let me know down below in the comments what you guys think, how you would rank the decks. Obviously, it might be different than me. And again, this is very preliminary, right? The format just started. So this is sort of going into the format what I think you can expect. So, you know, if 3 weeks from now this doesn't turn out to shape out how it would, I would be a little bit surprised. But yeah, don't, you know, take this for 100% granted 3 weeks from now into the format. This is sort of preliminary looking at it. I think this is how the format is going to sort of evolve. That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed. This has been Aaron from Top Tier Gaming. Bye, YouTube.